Northern France, August 1944. The greatest American victory of the war was about to become the greatest American disaster, and almost nobody saw it coming. This is the story of the Red Ball Express, the round-the-clock supply convoy that saved the Allied advance, the African-American soldiers who drove it, and the weapon that German generals feared more than any tank division or bomber fleet: American logistics. 2 months after D-Day, the Allied armies had finally broken out of Normandy. General George Patton's Third Army was racing across France at speeds that seemed impossible. His tanks were covering 50 miles a day, liberating towns that had been under Nazi occupation for 4 years. Paris fell on August 25th. The French people wept with joy as American soldiers rolled through streets they had never expected to see free again. Headlines across America proclaimed imminent victory. The war would be over by Christmas. Everyone was certain. Everyone was wrong. While correspondents filed triumphant dispatches and generals posed for photographs, a crisis was building that threatened to stop the Allied advance completely. The problem wasn't German resistance. The Wehrmacht was reeling, its divisions shattered, its soldiers surrendering by the thousands. The problem was something far more mundane and far more dangerous. The Allied armies were running out of everything they needed to fight. Patton's tanks consumed 400,000 gallons of gasoline every single day. His artillery fired thousands of tons of shells. His soldiers ate millions of rations. His vehicles broke down and needed spare parts. His wounded needed medical supplies. Every mile his army advanced added another mile between the front lines and the supply depots back in Normandy. And those supply depots were running empty because there was no way to move supplies fast enough to keep up with the advance. The mathematics were brutally simple. A Sherman tank got less than 1 mile per gallon. An armored division on the move consumed more fuel in a single day than a small American city used in a month. The Allied armies in France needed 20,000 tons of supplies every day just to maintain their positions. To attack, they needed far more. And the supply system was delivering less than half of what was required. Railways had been destroyed by Allied bombing, intentionally, to prevent German reinforcements from reaching Normandy. Now that destruction was crippling the Allied advance instead. The ports were still in German hands or too damaged to use. Cherbourg was operating at a fraction of its capacity. Antwerp, the deep-water port that could solve all supply problems, wouldn't be captured for months. The only way to move supplies was by truck, over roads that were never designed for military traffic, across distances that grew longer every day. By late August, forward units were literally running on empty. Tank crews siphoned fuel from disabled vehicles. Artillery batteries rationed shells. Soldiers went hungry because food convoys couldn't reach them. Patton's magnificent advance was grinding to a halt, not because of German resistance, but because his army had outrun its supply lines. The war that everyone thought was almost won was about to stall indefinitely. Something had to be done. Something unprecedented. Something that would move more supplies, faster, across longer distances than any military logistics operation in history. The solution would be called the Red Ball Express, and it would be driven primarily by men that America barely acknowledged as citizens. The name came from railroad terminology. In the early 20th century, American railways marked priority freight with a red ball symbol, indicating that these shipments should be expedited above all others. The Army adopted the term for its emergency supply operation, painting red balls on the trucks and on signs marking the dedicated routes. The symbolism was apt. This would be freight service on a scale that dwarfed anything the railroads had ever attempted. The concept was developed in desperation during the last week of August 1944. Colonel Loren Grubb of the Transportation Corps proposed a radical solution to the supply crisis. He would create dedicated one-way highways exclusively for military supply trucks. Civilian traffic would be banned. Military police would enforce speed limits and prevent unauthorized use. Trucks would run continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with drivers working in shifts to keep the vehicles moving. The routes would stretch from the supply depots near the Normandy beaches to the forward supply points behind Patton's advancing tanks, over 400 miles at the system's greatest extent. The proposal violated every principle of military logistics that had been taught for generations. Conventional wisdom held that supply lines should be short, that trucks should be used for final distribution from rail depots, that continuous operations would destroy vehicles and exhaust drivers. Grubb didn't care about conventional wisdom. Conventional wisdom said the advance should slow down until railways could be repaired. But the generals wanted to maintain momentum, to keep the Germans off balance, to end the war quickly. That meant finding a way to do what conventional wisdom said was impossible. On August 25, 1944, the Red Ball Express began operations. Within 48 hours, it had become the largest motor transport operation in military history. The scale was almost incomprehensible. At its peak, the Red Ball Express employed nearly 6,000 vehicles operating continuously on two parallel routes, one northbound, one southbound, that stretched across the French countryside. The trucks were primarily GMC CCKW 2.5-ton cargo trucks, known universally as deuce and a halves or simply Jimmies. They were rugged, reliable vehicles designed for exactly this kind of abuse, capable of carrying 5 tons despite their official rating when drivers overloaded them, which they always did. Each truck carried an average of 5 tons of supplies per trip. At peak operations, the Red Ball was delivering over 12,500 tons per day to forward areas. Over the 83 days of its operation, from August 25 to November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express delivered 412,193 tons of supplies across an average distance of 300 miles. Those numbers represented the difference between victory and stalemate. The routes were engineered for maximum efficiency. French roads were marked with distinctive signage. Red balls on white backgrounds indicated the express routes, with separate markings for the northbound and southbound lanes. Military police manned checkpoints every few miles, checking documentation, directing traffic, and enforcing the strict rules that kept the system running. No civilian vehicles were permitted. No stopping except for emergencies. Speed limits were set at 25 miles per hour during the day and 20 at night, though these limits were routinely ignored when commanders demanded faster delivery. The system operated on a complex schedule that would have impressed industrial engineers. Trucks departed from depots at staggered intervals to prevent congestion. Transfer points were established where exhausted drivers could hand off their vehicles to fresh crews without stopping. Maintenance checkpoints repaired minor breakdowns on the spot. Vehicles with serious problems were pushed off the road and cannibalized for parts. Nothing stopped. Nothing waited. The Red Ball kept rolling. But behind the statistics and the schedules were human beings. And the majority of those human beings were African American soldiers serving in a segregated army that treated them as second-class citizens even as it depended on them to win the war. The United States Army in 1944 was rigidly segregated by race. Black soldiers were generally prohibited from serving in combat roles, assigned instead to service and support units that white officers considered appropriate for men they regarded as inferior. Quartermaster units, transportation companies, engineering battalions, the backbreaking, unglamorous work of keeping an army supplied and moving, were disproportionately staffed by African Americans. This wasn't accidental. It reflected the deep racism of American military policy. Army studies commissioned before the war concluded that black soldiers lacked the intelligence and initiative for combat. White officers believed that black units would break under fire, that they required constant supervision, that they could perform manual labor but not complex military operations. These beliefs were false, completely, demonstrably, scientifically false, but they shaped Army policy throughout the war. The result was that when the Army needed thousands of truck drivers for the Red Ball Express, it turned to the quartermaster and transportation companies that were already doing the Army's driving. Approximately 75% of the Red Ball's drivers were African American. They would move more supplies, faster, across longer distances than any logistics operation in history. They would work under conditions that pushed human endurance to its limits. And they would receive almost no recognition for their contribution. The drivers came from all across America. Many were from the rural South, where limited economic opportunities made military service attractive despite the indignities of segregation. Others came from northern cities, where they had worked as laborers, factory workers, or drivers before the war. They had been promised training and opportunity by Army recruiters. What they got was backbreaking work, racial discrimination, and the constant reminder that their country did not consider them equal citizens. Their white officers were often Southerners who brought their racial attitudes with them. Black drivers were addressed by their first names or simply as boy, regardless of rank. They were housed in segregated facilities, fed in segregated mess halls, and forbidden from entering establishments that served white soldiers. When the Red Ball routes passed through French towns, local women who socialized with black soldiers were sometimes harassed by white American troops who couldn't tolerate interracial contact even in a foreign country. Yet these same men were expected to work 20-hour shifts driving through the night without headlights, delivering the supplies that made victory possible. The contradiction was stark and devastating. America needed them desperately but refused to treat them as Americans. The experience of driving the Red Ball was a study in exhaustion, danger, and determination. The official schedule called for drivers to work 10-hour shifts, but this was a fiction from the very beginning. Desperate commanders demanded faster delivery. Truck breakdowns meant surviving vehicles had to carry more loads. Drivers routinely worked 16, 18, even 24 hours without rest. The routes themselves were dangerous even under ideal conditions. French roads had been designed for horse carts and light civilian vehicles, not for convoys of heavy military trucks running continuously for weeks. The surfaces deteriorated under the constant pounding. Potholes appeared that could break axles or throw trucks off the road. Bridges rated for civilian traffic groaned under military loads. Some collapsed entirely, forcing convoys to detour through fields and streams. Night driving was the most dangerous. To avoid German aircraft, which still made occasional attacks on Allied supply lines, drivers ran without headlights after dark. They navigated by starlight, by the dim glow of the vehicle ahead, by instinct and faith. The trucks were painted olive drab, nearly invisible in darkness. Accidents were constant. Vehicles collided. Trucks ran off roads into ditches. Drivers fell asleep at the wheel and crashed into trees or other vehicles. The casualty rate from accidents far exceeded losses to enemy action. Private First Class Richard Blackwell, a driver from Mississippi, described the experience in a letter home. "We drive all night with no lights, just following the truck in front. You can barely see it. Maybe just the outline when the moon comes out. Your eyes hurt from staring. Your back hurts from the jolting. You can't hardly keep awake, but if you fall asleep you die. Or you kill the man behind you. So you keep driving." The fatigue was cumulative and merciless. After a week of continuous operations, drivers were hallucinating from exhaustion. They saw things that weren't there. German soldiers in the trees, children running across the road, trucks appearing from nowhere. Some drivers had to be physically restrained from continuing because they had lost the ability to recognize their own incapacity. Medical officers reported symptoms identical to combat fatigue in soldiers who had never been near the front lines. The vehicles suffered as badly as the men. The GMC trucks were rugged, but they had been designed for moderate use with regular maintenance. Running them continuously with minimal maintenance destroyed engines, transmissions, and tires at catastrophic rates. By the end of the Red Ball's operation, over 40% of the trucks that had started the campaign were no longer functional. Maintenance crews worked around the clock trying to keep vehicles running, cannibalizing wrecks for parts, improvising repairs with whatever materials were available. Tires were the critical shortage. Each truck had 10 tires, and the rough French roads chewed through rubber at rates that exhausted the supply chain. Drivers learned to nurse their tires, avoiding potholes when possible, reducing speed on rough stretches, checking pressure obsessively. But the demands of the schedule made conservation impossible. Trucks ran on bald tires, on patched tires, on tires that should have been replaced days earlier. Blowouts were constant. Changing a tire on the side of a dark road, exhausted, knowing that the convoy behind you was counting on your vehicle to keep moving. This was the reality of the Red Ball Express. German commanders watched the Allied supply situation with desperate hope and growing despair. They understood logistics better than most. The Wehrmacht had been struggling with supply problems since the opening days of the war. They had invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 with a force that was largely horse-drawn, and the Russian distances had broken their logistics system completely. Now, in France, they faced an enemy that seemed to have solved the fundamental problem of modern warfare: how to keep a mechanized army supplied across vast distances. German intelligence tracked the Red Ball Express with the same intensity they applied to Allied combat formations. They estimated truck volumes, calculated tonnages, mapped routes, and prepared reports for the high command. What they found was terrifying. The Americans were moving more supplies by truck than Germany moved by rail. They were maintaining an advance that should have been logistically impossible. They were solving problems that German planners had concluded were unsolvable. One German staff officer, captured in September 1944 and interrogated about enemy capabilities, focused almost entirely on logistics. "Your combat forces are good," he told his American interrogators, "but your logistics are what wins. We calculated that your advance would stop at the Seine. Your supplies could not keep pace with your tanks. But somehow you found a way. Your trucks never stopped. Your ammunition never ran out. We could not understand how you did it." The answer was simple. The Americans did it by treating logistics as a combat mission requiring the same intensity and sacrifice as frontline operations. German staff officers, trained in a tradition that treated supply as a support function secondary to operations, couldn't quite grasp that the Americans had made supply itself a priority equal to combat. German strategists identified the Red Ball Express as a critical vulnerability. If they could interdict the supply convoys, the American advance would stop. Luftwaffe planners proposed concentrated attacks on the truck routes. Ground commanders requested resources to raid behind American lines and disrupt the supply system. But by late 1944, Germany lacked the capability to execute these plans. Allied air superiority meant that German aircraft couldn't survive over the French countryside in daylight. German ground forces were too battered and too committed to defensive operations to spare units for raids. The Red Ball Express rolled on, unstoppable not because it was invulnerable but because the Germans no longer had the strength to stop it. German generals, interviewed after the war, consistently cited Allied logistics as one of the decisive factors in their defeat. "We could not compete," one general explained. "You had trucks we could not destroy, supplies we could not match, a system we could not disrupt. Your logistics defeated us as surely as your tanks." The comparison between German and American logistics was stark. The Wehrmacht in 1944 still depended heavily on horses for transport. Over 80% of German divisional transport was horse-drawn. This was not by choice. Germany lacked the industrial capacity and fuel supplies to fully motorize its forces. German logistics planning assumed railway transport for long distances and horse-drawn wagons for the final movement to combat units. When Allied bombing destroyed the French railway system, German supply capabilities collapsed. American forces, by contrast, were fully motorized. The United States produced more trucks during World War II than all other nations combined. The standardized GMC Deuce-and-a-half was manufactured by the hundreds of thousands, creating a supply of vehicles that could absorb the catastrophic attrition of continuous operations. When a German horse died, the unit lost transport capacity that was almost impossible to replace. When an American truck broke down, another truck was available within hours. The fuel situation compounded German disadvantages. American trucks ran on gasoline, which Allied tankers delivered across the Atlantic in quantities that seemed inexhaustible to German observers. German vehicles ran on gasoline that had to be synthesized from coal at enormous industrial expense, in factories that were constant targets for Allied bombing. By late 1944, German forces were literally immobilized by fuel shortages. Tanks sat in forests, unable to move. Vehicles were abandoned when their fuel ran out. The vaunted German mechanized forces became infantry by default. German generals understood this disparity with painful clarity. "We were fighting an industrial war with pre-industrial logistics," one officer wrote after the war. "The Americans could replace in a week what took us months to build. They could move in a day what took us a week. The mathematics were impossible." The psychological impact was equally significant. German soldiers who saw the endless stream of American supplies, the trucks, the equipment, the food, the ammunition, understood viscerally that they were fighting an enemy with resources beyond their imagination. Prisoners taken in late 1944 frequently expressed astonishment at Allied abundance. Some broke down crying when they saw American mess halls, comparing the food to the starvation rations they had been receiving. The Red Ball Express was not just delivering supplies. It was demonstrating American industrial and organizational superiority with every truck that passed. Meanwhile, the men driving those trucks remained invisible. The American press covered Patton's dash across France, Hodge's advance through Belgium, Montgomery's operations in the north. Correspondents embedded with combat units filed stories about brave soldiers fighting Germans. The logistics that made those operations possible were mentioned, if at all, as background details. The men who drove the trucks were never named, never photographed, never celebrated. This invisibility had two sources. First, supply operations were simply not considered newsworthy. The American public wanted stories of combat, of heroes killing enemies, of dramatic battles with clear outcomes. Truck driving, however essential, was boring. It didn't photograph well. It didn't produce the kind of narratives that sold newspapers or generated heroic imagery. Second, the drivers were black. American media in 1944 was not interested in celebrating African American achievement. The prevailing narrative held that black soldiers served in support roles because they were incapable of combat, not because the army deliberately assigned them there. Stories about black truck drivers performing essential service would have complicated this narrative, suggesting that black soldiers were in fact competent, dedicated, and crucial to victory. Most editors and correspondents simply ignored the racial composition of the Red Ball Express, mentioning neither the contribution nor the discrimination that accompanied it. The soldiers themselves understood their position with bitter clarity. "We're good enough to die for this country, but not good enough to eat in the same mess hall as white soldiers," one driver wrote. "We deliver the ammunition that wins the battles, but when they write the history, we won't be in it. That's how America works." Some black newspapers, notably the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender, covered the Red Ball Express and other African-American military contributions. These publications reached millions of black readers who were hungry for stories of their community service. But mainstream white media ignored these achievements, and the white majority that controlled America's historical memory barely registered the contribution. The contrast with white combat units was devastating. Patton's Third Army received constant press coverage. His tank commanders were profiled in magazines. His victories were celebrated in newsreels shown in theaters across America. The men who delivered Patton's fuel, without which his tanks would have stopped moving within 48 hours, received nothing. Not medals, not recognition, not even acknowledgement that they existed. After the war, this pattern continued. The official histories mentioned the Red Ball Express as a logistical achievement but rarely discussed the racial composition of the driver corps. Veterans organizations celebrated combat heroes. Hollywood made movies about infantry battles and tank charges. The truck drivers who had worked themselves to exhaustion, who had died in accidents on dark French roads, who had made the victory possible, faded from memory. The Red Ball Express officially ceased operations on November 16, 1944, when the capture of Antwerp finally provided a deep-water port close enough to the front to supply the Allied armies by more conventional means. By then, the trucks had delivered 412,193 tons of supplies across 3.6 million vehicle miles. They had consumed astronomical quantities of fuel themselves. The Red Ball used almost as much gasoline as it delivered, a statistic that illustrated both its desperate necessity and its inherent inefficiency. The human cost was significant. Hundreds of drivers died in accidents. Thousands more were injured. Countless men suffered permanent health effects from the exhaustion, exposure, and stress of continuous operations. There are no precise casualty figures because nobody bothered to compile them. Supply units didn't receive the same attention as combat units when it came to record keeping. The men who died on the Red Ball were buried without ceremony, their deaths noted in unit logs but rarely investigated or commemorated. The vehicles suffered even worse. Of the nearly 6,000 trucks that served on the Red Ball Express, over 2,000 were destroyed or worn beyond repair. Maintenance units worked miracles keeping the surviving vehicles running, but the attrition rate was staggering. Each truck represented thousands of man-hours of industrial labor, shipped across the Atlantic at enormous expense. The Red Ball consumed this investment like a fire consumes fuel. But the alternative was defeat. Without the Red Ball Express, the Allied advance would have stalled at the Seine River in late August. Patton's tanks would have run dry within days. The liberation of France would have taken months longer. The war would have continued into 1946 or beyond. German forces would have had time to strengthen their defenses, to deploy new weapons, to kill thousands more Allied soldiers. The expenditure of trucks and men, however horrific, was the price of victory. German commanders understood this calculus better than most Americans. In post-war interviews, they repeatedly cited Allied logistics as the decisive factor in their defeat. "We could stop your attacks," one German general observed, "but we could not stop your supplies. Every time we destroyed your tanks, you replaced them. Every time we killed your soldiers, more arrived. Your logistics were inexhaustible, and that meant our defeat was inevitable." The legacy of the Red Ball Express extended far beyond the specific operation. It demonstrated that motor transport could sustain military operations at scales previously thought impossible. It proved that logistics could be treated as a combat mission requiring the same intensity and sacrifice as frontline operations. It established principles of continuous operations, dedicated routes, and systematic maintenance that would shape military logistics for generations. The Korean War saw similar operations when United Nations forces needed to supply armies across the rugged Korean peninsula. The lessons of the Red Ball, continuous operations, dedicated routes, systematic maintenance, were applied directly. Vietnam brought the same challenges to a new generation, and logistics officers studied the Red Ball Express as they planned operations in Southeast Asia. Modern military logistics still reflects Red Ball principles. The concept of just-in-time delivery, keeping supplies moving continuously rather than building up large depots, traces directly to the Red Ball's continuous operations. The emphasis on standardization, using a small number of vehicle types that share parts and can be maintained efficiently, follows the Red Ball's experience with the GMC truck. The integration of logistics planning into operational planning, rather than treating supply as an afterthought, came from hard lessons learned in France in 1944. The racial dimension of the Red Ball Express also had lasting implications, though these took decades to fully materialize. The service of African American soldiers in World War II, including the truck drivers of the Red Ball, contributed to the eventual desegregation of the American military in 1948. Black veterans returned home having served their country with distinction, only to face continued discrimination and segregation. Their determination to claim the equality they had earned through service helped fuel the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. President Harry Truman's Executive Order 9981, which desegregated the armed forces, came just 4 years after the Red Ball Express ceased operations. The men who had driven those trucks, who had worked themselves to exhaustion in service of a nation that treated them as second-class citizens, were part of the generation that demanded change. Their service had proven that the racist assumptions underlying segregation were false. Their sacrifice had earned them the right to equal treatment. It took decades for America to fully acknowledge this, but the process began with their service. The comparison between the Red Ball Express drivers and celebrated combat commanders reveals uncomfortable truths about how America remembers its wars. George Patton received a state funeral and has been the subject of multiple major films. His image adorns recruiting posters and his quotes are memorized by military officers. The drivers who delivered his fuel received nothing. Not a single major film has been made about the Red Ball Express. No monuments stand to the men who made the Allied advance possible. This disparity reflects deep biases in American culture. We celebrate warriors and ignore the workers who support them. We memorialize individuals and forget the systems that enable their achievements. We remember white heroes and forget black ones. The Red Ball Express drivers suffered from all three biases. They were support troops, they were part of a system rather than individual heroes, and they were black. Their invisibility was overdetermined. Yet their contribution was indispensable. Every tank that Patton sent into battle ran on fuel delivered by the Red Ball. Every artillery shell fired at German positions had been trucked from Normandy by black drivers working through the night. Every meal eaten by combat soldiers, every bandage applied to wounds, every bullet fired at the enemy, all of it had been delivered by men that America preferred not to acknowledge. The German officers who fought against the Allied forces understood this better than most Americans. They didn't care about American racial prejudices. They cared about winning the war, and they knew that they couldn't win against an enemy with unlimited supplies. The Red Ball Express terrified them precisely because it represented an advantage they couldn't match and couldn't overcome. No amount of German tactical brilliance could compensate for American logistical superiority. When German generals in post-war interviews cited Allied logistics as a decisive factor in their defeat, they were paying tribute to the Red Ball Express drivers without knowing their names or their race. The tribute was more honest than anything the American public offered. German professionals, analyzing their own defeat, understood that the trucks mattered more than the tanks. American civilians, celebrating their victory, never understood this at all. The story of the Red Ball Express contains lessons that extend far beyond military history. It demonstrates that unglamorous work can be more important than celebrated achievements. The truck drivers who delivered supplies mattered more to Allied victory than most combat commanders. Their work was boring, exhausting, dangerous, and essential. Without them, nothing else would have been possible. It demonstrates that recognition and importance are completely different things. The men who received medals and headlines were not necessarily the men who contributed most to victory. The correlation between fame and significance was weak at best. The public's attention went to stories that were dramatic and photogenic, not to operations that actually decided outcomes. It demonstrates that American racism distorted not just the treatment of black soldiers but the understanding of the war itself. By ignoring African American contributions, America created a false history of World War II that left out essential elements. The Red Ball Express was one of the most important operations of the European campaign, and it was staffed primarily by black soldiers. You cannot understand the war without understanding this, but mainstream American memory tried for decades to do exactly that. Most importantly, the Red Ball Express demonstrates that victory in war depends on systems, not just individuals. The American military's superiority over the Wehrmacht wasn't just a matter of brave soldiers or brilliant generals. It was a matter of industrial capacity, organizational skill, and systemic efficiency. The ability to move 12,500 tons of supplies per day by truck across 300 miles was not heroism in the traditional sense. It was something more valuable, competence at scale. The men who drove those trucks deserved better than they received. They deserved recognition for their contribution. They deserved equal treatment in the military they served. They deserved to come home to a country that honored their sacrifice. They received none of these things. What they received instead was exhaustion, discrimination, and invisibility. But they also received something else, something that no one could take away. They knew what they had accomplished. They knew that the victory depended on them. They knew that every headline about Patton's tanks was actually a headline about their fuel deliveries. They knew that the war was won on their backs, in their trucks, on those dark French roads where they drove without headlights and without recognition. The Red Ball Express drivers were American heroes in every sense that mattered. That America refused to acknowledge this says more about America than about them. They did their duty. They saved the war. They earned a place in history that their country denied them. 75 years later, it is time to tell their story accurately, completely, and with the honor they always deserved.